wonderful exhibit, Women Cast Their Ballots, celebrating the 100 years of the suffrage movement. We are so excited today about our lecture, and we are so happy to be partnering with the League of Women Voters in this wonderful exhibit. I hope you all will be able to come take a look at our museum or go on to our virtual tours at some point, which our exhibit will be up until next March. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tico Hossman, who's going to introduce our wonderful speakers today. Tico?
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. It is my pleasure today to introduce this dynamic duo for today's presentation. Before I introduce them, I just want to remind everybody that the Heritage Society has a Houston suffrage exhibit that is available online. It is only $5 to tour, and you get a self-guided book. So we'd like to invite you to please visit our online exhibit for the suffrage exhibit, and you can go to heritagesociety.org to purchase those tickets. And so today's presentation is titled Women Advancing Women in and Through the Law in 2020 and Beyond. And it will be presented by Cisselon, Nichols, Hurd, and Linda Broocks. Cisselon serves as a senior counsel with Shell, and Linda is a trial partner with Keene Miller LLP. They are both affiliated with the Center for Women in Law. Cisselon is a founder and vice president of the executive committee, and Linda is a founder and immediate past president of the executive committee. Just one more reminder, if you would please mute your phone during the presentation. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you ladies.
All right, let me move this so that I can get this on. Good afternoon. We're delighted to be here and to share with you a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and women's right to vote. Cisselon and I today are going to focus on the women lawyers who were instrumental both in achieving the awesome goal of suffrage and also continuing to fight for women's rights through today and with plans for the future. Now, many of you may not know that women lawyers began fighting for women's rights long before the passage of the 19th Amendment. But first, they had to fight for the right even to be lawyers. Now, on this slide, Cisselon and I have listed just a few of the very many courageous women legal trailblazers who fought first for the right to become lawyers, and then once achieving that right, fought for the rights of other women in overcoming their struggles. Now, in the 19th and early 20th century, most of the struggles that women encountered really resulted from a single fact, that they had no voice in a government that controlled literally their entire lives. Without a voice, without a vote, they had no voice. And so they knew that to have a voice, they needed to get a vote. Women lawyers were instrumental in every step of that way. And on this slide, as I said, these are just a few of the women who participated and contributed to that effort. Cisselon and I are going to highlight two of them. Mary Shadd Cary, who's second on the list, the first woman to get a law degree at Howard University, and Hortense Ward, who was in 1910 the first woman to pass the Texas bar.
Thanks, Linda. I would like to express my gratitude to Linda for doing a lot of research. We both learned in this process, and we were able to identify women that we were not familiar with, and one of them being Mary Ann Shadd Cary. She was born in Delaware, the oldest of 13 children to free Black American parents. She ultimately had a lot of firsts in her life. When she was 10 years old, her family moved to the free state of Pennsylvania. And after receiving a Quaker education, she became a teacher who devoted the first part of her life to abolition, working with fugitive slaves. She was inspired in this work by her father, who worked for an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. It was run by the famed abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, which you may have heard of. In 1853, she founded Canada's first anti-slavery newspaper, the Provincial Freeman. It was a weekly publication that encouraged Blacks to free America, to Canada for their freedom. Of course, in this male-dominated profession, she had to hide the fact of her position as editor, but still she lectured in Canada and the United States to increase subscriptions. She also publicly solicited aid for runaway slaves at a great risk to her own personal welfare. Her family and friends knew the dynamic young female editor as the rebel. Of course, I love this about her. In 1856, she married a Toronto barber, and I may not have pointed out that when she went to Canada, she went to Ontario, and she married the barber, and they never lived together, yet they did have 2 children. She was a woman way ahead of her times. In 1860, he died, leaving her pregnant with their second child and 3 stepchildren. Nevertheless, she persisted, and she went on to return to the U.S. at the start of the Civil War to become a recruiting officer for the Union Army in Indiana. She then taught in D.C. public schools, and while teaching during the day and making occasional speaking engagements throughout the country in her spare time, she began to study law at Howard University. And she did that for a few years, but she did not complete her studies until 1883. And at that time, she was the only Black woman in her class to receive a law degree that year. Little is known of her legal practice, but she did give up teaching to do that. Next slide. In the rest of her spare time, she became heavily involved with the women's suffrage movement. She was a member of the National Women's Suffrage Association and spoke at that organization's 1878 convention. She was a founder of the Colored Women's Progressive Franchise Association. And as a suffragist, she fought alongside Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She even had the audacity to testify before a House Judiciary Committee advocating for the 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship, and the 15th Amendment granted African-American men the right to vote. Of course, she was very critical in her testimony to Congress because it did not give women, African-American women, the right to vote. Carey also participated. She hung around when the suffragists got a little more radical. They actually came up with an idea to try and register to vote. Like, screw it. You don't want to add us to the amendment. You don't want to pass the law. We're just going to go and do it. And that I loved about her. And she did attempt to no avail. But as a free Black woman, she experienced sexism and racism in the North, and segregation and male-only careers limited her social mobility, both as a publisher, as a journalist in the newspaper space, and as a lawyer, but she never, ever backed down in the fight for equality and women's rights to vote. And next slide, Linda. Largely due to the efforts of women like Mary Ann Shadd Cary over a period of 60 years, by 1913, the suffrage movement had reached a crescendo. And this is the March 1913 Women's March in DC. And I mean, just look at the multitude of people.
And of course, leading the way was a lawyer, Inez Mulholland, and you can see her there in her white robe on her white horse, leading basically as the Grand Marshal thousands of women from all over the country marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. But not only were there thousands of marchers, there were thousands of people who wanted to deter those marchers. And you can see in this picture, basically it's a mob. And this mob threw things at the women. Police refused to intervene. And despite the violence that hospitalized over 100 of the women and injured many more, they persevered. They kept going on that march. The police refusal to fulfill their duties became an object of some national attention. Newspapers all over the country criticized them. An investigation was opened. This really created a lot of sympathy for suffragists and really emboldened their future efforts. And some of those future efforts were led right here in Houston by Hortense Sparks Ward. Many of you had the opportunity to hear more about Hortense in a previous lecture in this series. She was a remarkable woman. She, as I said, was the first woman to pass the Texas bar, which she did in 1910, and shortly thereafter joined her husband in his law practice. By 1915, she was licensed to practice before the United States Supreme Court. Now, she did not argue a case there. You'll hear more about the fact that that didn't happen for quite some time, but she was licensed before the Supreme Court. And she was a tireless advocate for women's rights. She wrote pamphlets and newspaper articles. She lobbied legislators for a lot of the legislation that for rights that we really take for granted today. Who knew that only 100 years ago, women didn't have the right to own property in their own names, to manage their own separate property if they were married, to have their own earnings if they were married, to enter into commercial contracts. These are things we take for granted today. But without the efforts of people like women like Hortense, we wouldn't have those rights. And of course, you guessed it, she was a suffragist. She not only lobbied hard for the passage of the 19th Amendment in Washington, she actually drafted a bill that the Texas Legislature passed in 1918. This was it was a primary bill that allowed women to vote in Texas primaries. Passed in 1918, and on June 27th of that same year, Hortense became the first woman registered in Harris County to vote. Now, Hortense she wasn't satisfied with just registering herself. She wanted there to be power in numbers. And she wrote newspaper articles and a particular pamphlet that got distributed statewide. And it is credited with 386,000 women registering to vote in Texas within a period of 17 days after that pamphlet. Truly remarkable. Now, before we move on to other heroines and chronicles of heroines in the voting rights, I want to share with you another very interesting fact about Hortense. In 1925, the governor of Texas appointed her as a special Chief Justice of a special all-women Supreme Court. And the way this came about was that there was a case involving the Woodmen of the World. It was a fraternal organization that every single justice of the Supreme Court and virtually every male member of the Texas bar belonged to. As a result, Hortense became the first woman to be Chief Justice of a court in the entire country. Now, she and her co-panel members deliberated on the case for quite some time. Hortense wrote the opinion, and remarkably, that opinion has been cited 30 times by subsequent courts, most recently by the Texas Supreme Court in 2009. Cisselon?
So even with the incredible accomplishment of the 19th Amendment being passed, women were only beginning to achieve equality under the law. And throughout the South, women and men of color and poor white women continued to be denied the right through the imposition of Jim Crow laws. And I do want to make the point here that a lot of people really don't think about the fact that Black women were not given the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. It's just sort of, I guess, not taught very clearly in the schools. And so I want to leave you with that. And I've seen a lot of people highlight and celebrate women's suffrage, and they don't make that footnote. I mean, they really do celebrate it as if all women were granted the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, and that was not the case. And in fact, various tactics were used to suppress voters, with poll taxes being the most broad-based method to keep Blacks and poor whites from voting. In Southern states, people had to pay $25 to $50 in today's money to vote, and this effectively prevented all low-income people from voting, which was the goal. Also, literacy tests. 100 years ago, many adults, Black or white, could not read. Some were allowed to vote if they could understand what was read to them, but voting officials who were uniformly white sometimes claimed that whites could understand the readings, but Blacks could not, even when they clearly could. Also, purges. In fact, that's in the news today, but from time to time, white officials would purge the voting rolls without notice, that wouldn't reach the poor areas of town. So that resulted in Blacks and poor whites showing up at the polls to see that they were no longer eligible to vote, and they could not re-register until after the election. And in researching this, I was looking at some of the photographs of people voting, and it was something that I saw on PBS not too long ago, where for African Americans after 1965, I mean, people dressed up to go to the polls in their Sunday best. It was a whole thing. And I think people lose sight of the point that Linda made earlier, that, you know, really having your vote really is your voice in a democracy and is uber important. And so looking at some of that footage just gave me a lot of pride. I vote in all elections, big or small. However, I don't always dress up. And so I actually have been known to go to the polls in my workout clothes, but I might rethink that after working on this presentation. They also look to exclude former prisoners, and that's still a thing. I think most states have reinstated those rights, but they still are making it more difficult. Florida comes to mind, like saying if they hadn't paid restitution or fines and so forth, that they couldn't vote in our most recent election. I think some people, athletes and so forth, stepped up and paid off a lot of that, but that's still going on. And then violence. And Linda made the point of like listing these in ascending order, right? As it got just more serious, right? And Blacks who tried to vote were threatened, beaten, and even killed without any legal consequences. And this, of course, brings to mind John Lewis, right? Because I think it's recent times that people really realized that he took a brick to his head and it really could have killed him. And a lot of what was going on there was, you know, standing up for the right to vote. And so I really that's why I said I vote in like school board elections, city count, whatever. If I'm given an opportunity, I really make a point to vote, and I hope that's the same for all of you.
And also, the 19th Amendment didn't ensure equality for women lawyers. Here in Texas, it was another 32 years before the first woman argued a case before the United States Supreme Court. Hortense had been licensed to practice, but no woman argued until 1952. It was another 33 years after the 19th Amendment that we had our first African-American female lawyer, Charlie Ferris. And 35 years later, Edna Cisneros became the very first Hispanic woman to become a lawyer in Texas. And nationwide, the situation wasn't much better. This is a list of just some of the very few incredibly well-qualified women who, after graduating at the very top of their respective classes from some of the best law schools in the country, could not find a job. I'm sure you recognize all of these women, but of course, most notable among them are two former justices of the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
And so we as lawyers, that was very shocking, I think, for the female lawyers in my class and the younger lawyers that I mentor, right? It's just really unfathomable that women didn't get these opportunities. And as late as 1970, right, late 70s, here are some of the things that these New York law firm management people actually said in an while being interviewed, right, on this issue. Well, they were just like, we don't like to hire women. We hire some women, but not many. And we just hired a woman. We couldn't possibly hire another one. And these people were very frank. We don't expect the same kind of work from women as we do from men. And women don't receive more than whatever the salary was, these paltry salaries. Women don't become partners. And this is the one that really just upsets my apple cart. Are you planning on having children? And I mean, this was in the 70s. So it's just amazing. But the women lawyers persevere. So like I mentioned earlier, the more significant change came for Black women with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally outlawed the discriminatory practices stemming from Jim Crow, right? The poll taxes and literacy tests, that we discussed earlier. And while President LBJ, President Johnson, and Dr. King, Martin Luther King, and other male civil rights leaders are rightly given much credit for the passage of the Voting Rights Act, there are many unsung heroines who were instrumental in bringing about this legislation. And Linda is going, because she's such an awesome researcher, Linda is going to next highlight one of these women who was absolutely would not have happened without her.
Yes, Reverend Dr. Paulie Murray, again, a lawyer, was one of those women. And she has been called simultaneously the most important activist of the 20th century and yet the most unrepresented. And neither Cisselon nor I knew who she was before we began this research. And we've kind of done an informal poll. We haven't found anybody who knew who she was. I want to read a quote to you from historian Susan Ware, who says about her, "It may be when historians look back on 20th century America, all roads will lead to Paulie Murray. She was involved in all major developments historians of the United States write about when they try to make sense of the 20th century, especially the movements for social change that have been so central to its history. Civil rights, feminism, religion, literature, law, sexuality, no matter what the subject, there is Paulie Murray." As with all the other women, spectacular women we're discussing today, I could spend our entire time talking about her. But moving to her particular contributions to voting rights, her contributions began with an idea she had in 1947 when she was a law student, the only woman law student at Howard University at that time. The idea came to her, I believe it was in con law class, that what if we challenged Jim Crow on the basis that segregation is unconstitutional? It seems obvious now, but it was a unique idea at the time. I know of no one who had it before she did. She elaborated on this idea in her book in 1950 called States' Laws on Race and Color. Thurgood Marshall, who argued and won the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education, called this book the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. As you know, that case determined, the Supreme Court determined that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. And Thurgood Marshall used this book and its arguments heavily in his winning argument. Paulie also coined the term Jane Crow to describe what she thought was the fact that Black women were even more devastated than Black men by Jim Crow. And this is what she said about it. Black women have been doubly victimized by the twin immoralities of Jim Crow and Jane Crow. Black women faced with these dual barriers have often found that sex bias is more formidable than racial bias. And her articulation of Jane Crow really informed the criticisms that she had of the male-dominated civil rights movement. She was always arguing that women ought to be in the forefront because they were facing these dual barriers and that sexism and racism had to be addressed in tandem. But specifically in support of the 65 Voting Rights Act, in 1964, she delivered a very influential speech in Washington, D.C. called Jim Crow and Jane Crow.
Yes, and I can't wait to learn more about Dr. Paulie Murray. And one person that I know a lot about, and I did tell Linda, you know, we had to discuss Barbara Jordan because she was so important in this space, and she was so important in my life. I mean, you are looking at a person that when other girls were playing with dolls and doing all of that stuff, I was reciting portions of Barbara Jordan's speech regarding the impeachment of Richard Nixon. And my mother says there's a cassette tape, and my sister wants her to really hand it over so that she can really tease me about it. The thing about Congresswoman ultimately Jordan in this space was, while the 1965 Voting Right Act was important, little changed in Texas, right? And other southern states. And so she had to step into the fray. She had only joined Texas's congressional delegation in 1972. She had nevertheless established herself as a prominent and influential voice, in part because of her famous speech that I just mentioned. But I also have to tell you, in reading her biographies, she knew the rules, and she was such a master of the rules in the Texas Senate that it made people's head hurt. And so I think that's one of the things that I really think her being a lawyer and being underestimated as a female and the dual bias and a Black lawyer, they were not ready for her. And so she introduced an amendment to the 1975 extension of the Voting Rights Act, providing that Texas would be added to the states whose voting procedures would come under specific federal scrutiny. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the act, but the 65 Act picked out certain states and put them under a consent decree, and they had to make these changes, and they had to be under the watchful eye so that Blacks weren't disenfranchised. And despite the fact that Barbara Jordan got huge resistance, right? Even from members of the Black caucus. And that's one of the things that people, if you haven't studied that whole era, and I think a little bit of it goes on now, you have these career politicians, and they stay in line and they keep their constituency in line. And that's what people expected here in dealing with her. But when they realized how wicked smart she was and that she was way ahead of the game, right? They had to, she highlighted and put her focus on the Hispanic community, who were also subject to voter suppression. So, I mean, that just shows you how savvy she was. She's like, okay, Black caucus, if you want to give me drama and you don't want to play along, then I'm going to highlight other injustices, which she was going to do all along, but that really became the focus, right? And so once it was passed, it made an immediate difference. Within months, the DOJ stopped a massive voter purge in Texas. And by 1985, the number of Hispanic persons holding Texas municipal and county offices had increased by 58%. The city councils of the nation's 3 largest cities, New York, LA, and Chicago, they were integrated. And this is the important piece here, right? Upon reflection, Congresswoman Jordan considered her work on the 1975 legislation to be the most important of her civil rights work in Congress. So that's key, and that's what women lawyers were about. And I think we've made it clear to you, and I'll say it again, the right to vote is fundamental to equal opportunities in every aspect of life. The road has been long and hard. And the next slide will show you where we are today. This has always interests me, and there was a documentary that came out a little bit ago called Misrepresentation, and it's like MISS, misrepresentation, and it highlights just the systemic gender bias, right, in this country, in the US. And I think that that's why we are so behind some of these other nations. And when I first became aware of this, I was just really stunned. Now, we may be doing a little bit better after the recent election. I do believe that more women were seated. So maybe we'll move up a bit, but we are not where we are supposed to be. I do think that that's why the election of Kamala Harris as vice president, maybe we will see a huge shift, right? Like she said in her acceptance speech, she's the first, but she will not be the last.
Well, and the fact that the United States is only minuscule points above Bangladesh is really shocking to me. We're also behind economically. Women are behind economically. What you see on this chart are average weekly salaries of men and women across demographic groups. And as you can see, across all of these demographic groups, women have a significant gender pay gap, overall 20%. Approximately. Now, there's no doubt about the fact that things are much better than they were before the passage of the 19th Amendment, and much better than they even were 10 years ago. But we still have a good ways to go, and women are still heavily involved in trying to address these inequities. And the situation in the legal profession is no exception. As this chart shows, entering law school, women are about almost 50% of the class. But as we go up the ladder toward positions with more power, more lucrative positions, those numbers dwindle significantly. While we're 48% of entering law school class, only 19%. And that number actually is a big jump from just a couple of years ago when it was 16. So things are improving, but mightily slowly. And for women of color, you can see this is even more drastic, from 16% of entering class to only 3% in equity partnership. It's statistics like these. You heard Tico say that Cisselon and I are founders of the Center for Women in Law. Well, I want to talk about the Center for Women in Law next. It's statistics like these that led a group of us to envision the Center for Women in Law. And we were concerned that while, most of us, our law school classes were fairly large. I was 30% women in my law school class. By the time you reach the ranks of equity partnership or high positions in corporate law firms, our numbers had dwindled significantly in comparison to white men. And we wanted to identify and tackle the factors that if there were factors, and we believed that there were, that kept women from achieving the success that would keep them in the legal profession. And why did we want to keep them in the legal profession? So that they would remain in the army of women lawyers who are fighting constantly for more women's rights. So after lots of strategic planning, we launched in 2009, we launched the Center for Women in Law at our first biennial Women's Power Summit. We invited, and they did attend, women lawyer leaders from all over the country. And we created a platform for all of these women lawyer groups to collaborate rather than working in silos as we had before, to collaborate, cooperate, and work together, share our work to bring about meaningful change. The mission, of course, as I just said, is to be this national resource for women lawyers, to generate change for in the legal profession and for the entirety of society, because we think that this is where it starts. Our vision is that the legal profession show just equity, justice for all, and for not just women lawyers and not just for lawyers, but for all of society. And we achieve our objectives by, as I said, convening the leaders at things like the summit and other gatherings, generating ideas through the work that we're sharing and the research that we're doing, and then leading change through concrete programs. And by concrete programs, I mean programs that seek to really address the factors that we have identified and to build on the research that we have done. I'd like to share with you a portion of a short video that highlights one of the center's very important programs. And this particular program focuses on law students and judicial clerks with the thought that arming these young women with certain skills will prepare them for achieving the greatest possible success and the greatest possible trajectory for their careers, so that we keep them in our army of women's rights advocates.
Center for Women in Law at the Institute, when I attended my first year, taught me about self-promotion, and that was something that I was always very uncomfortable with. After the workshop and after getting feedback from practicing attorneys, I was really able to understand that you're simply promoting yourself, telling everyone about your achievements, and telling them how you can help them in that moment.
I've met amazing speakers who have really clued us in on the difference between fixed mindset and growth mindset.
Growth mindset is just basically the ability to be resilient. So something that I just learned today at the Institute is, would you rather be a tennis ball or an easily crackable egg? When you let it drop and when it falls, which one would you rather be? The ability to rebound back and bounce back higher than you were before is really what growth mindset is about.
There are things that are within your control, and by addressing that, you can be a confident attorney, which I think is so crucial for your own ability to have faith in yourself as an attorney.
I can take the tools that the Center for Women in Law has taught me and teach them to other women, and also use them throughout my life.
The Center for Women in Law has taught me how to be a professional. So law school taught me about the law, but the center taught me real life skills.
So the Center for Women in Law helped me the moment I walked through the doors 1L year, and the fact that I know they're going to be there after I graduate is so comforting. They're going to be there to support me even beyond graduation day.
Honestly, the center, I did not think it would be such a big part of my life.
They taught me how to better talk about my achievements and how to not be ashamed of my success.
Your opinions matter, your thoughts are valid, you're just as smart and competent as everybody else.
Really just take ownership of who you are and be proud of that.
I'm really grateful to the women who have established the center. I think it's so important and wonderful. So to the donors and to the sponsors, thank you so much.
The center has been so essential to my success at UT Law. They've made me a confident person. They've made me more professional, and just, I cannot thank them enough for everything that they have done for me.
I think Linda did a great job of explaining to you the center and the concept. However, she did not do a great job of really talking about how awesome she and the original founders were. I'm a founder because I plopped down some cash to join after it was already set up. And she also, the very first Power Summit, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor was there. And that was so incredibly awesome. And we have continued to do this work because we want to make sure the future Paulie Murrays and younger Barbara Jordans and the like, and the women are there to continue the fight. We think that it's, the slide that Linda showed where the classes start out. And when I was in law school, I'm pretty sure it was 50-50. It might have been like right on the mark, 51-49. And so even with that, the women have not had the success at the pinnacle of the profession. And yet, as is shown today, women lawyers play a substantial role, right, in advancing rights for all in society. So we are very excited about our biennial awards luncheon that's coming up. I happen to be the co-chair, and Soledad O'Brien did a very nice piece on women's suffrage. I don't know if you guys, her show is called Matter of Fact. You can Google that. It was very well done. And at that luncheon, we will be honoring Patricia Diaz-Dennis with the Hortense Ward Courageous Leader Award. This recognizes one outstanding women lawyer that exemplifies Ward's tenacity, courage, and commitment in her efforts to achieve gender parity in positions of leadership, influence, and responsibility in the legal profession. So we feel like if you called into this luncheon for this luncheon presentation, you might also be interested in our awards luncheon, and we would love to see you there.
And that concludes our presentation. We really thank you for being with us, and we are available for any discussion that people would like to have.
Great, thank you both. That was amazing. I learned so many new things. I'm in awe of you all, very inspirational. We are happy to open this up now for Q&A, and I believe Lisa's going to help me facilitate that. And
I'm not on the screen. I'm unmuted though. I'm Betty Chapman, one of the curators of the exhibit, and I just want to say thank you. This was just absolutely great. And I can tell you, when we began planning everything in January, Ann Sloan, who was the co-curator with me, the first thing we said we wanted as one of the special lectures had to do with women lawyers. And that was back in January. And then, of course, we had the contact with Brenda Hunsaker and found you all. This is exactly what we had in mind. And I just want to thank you so wonderfully well for doing this for us today. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Yes, absolutely.
I'd also like to introduce, as Betty said, Betty and Ann are in the Zoom meeting, as well as our other co-curator, Ray Bryant, which uncovered her group, the Houston Suffragist Project, uncovered some research that is not well known. I mean, in particularly, it made its debut for the exhibit, and Ray uncovered the fact that African American women back in 1920 in Harris County could vote, which is an amazing story. Ray, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you for inviting me today. And I want to echo Betty's. Can everybody hear me? I don't have my visual.
Yes.
I want to echo Betty's comments because this story keeps getting broader and broader. And I think with the larger goals of encouraging women in law and young women to go into law and the effect they can have on our society, knowing the history, that it goes very deep and the foundation of it, gives us all courage and makes us see that we aren't singular individuals struggling, that through working together, we've made amazing strides, but there's much left to do.
Yes.
A couple things. I know Lisa wants me to mention about the Black women voting, but our group's been working with Frank Heredia at the District Court, Harris County District Court Archives, and he has located not only the 1920 lawsuit, which enabled 14,000 women in Harris County to vote. But also the original court case where Hortense Ward was the attorney in 1910. And there's another court case he and I worked on was in 1955, which was the first case where women were on the jury. People don't realize it took another full generation before women were even allowed to be on juries.
Right.
So part of that effort, and I'm putting it out there, is that he has a program set up to archive and preserve documents. And so if there's any members of your organization or anyone you know who would like to contribute to that, that's all donation. And it would be preserving women's history and suffrage history in Houston and Harris County. So I'm just putting it out there. We don't know where people's specific interests are, and when we know where we can step up, that makes a big difference, which is part of why we're doing this. The women in the South, the Black women in particular, were heavily affected by the poll tax in some states, like in South Carolina, Georgia. Even when Black women went to vote in 1920 and offered to pay the poll tax, their ballots were marked. They put them in the box and then they were removed. So Cisselon, I just thought you would find that very interesting, that's why in states literally in 1920 there are 0 Black women votes. They just mark their ballots. But in our county, newspaper counts 6,000 Black women. You referenced the presentation earlier. Thank you, because this is a historic lawsuit. It probably didn't happen anywhere else in the South. With the number of women and how the whole community stepped up and worked together and how well they were organized, which speaks to the whole community, how they viewed suffrage for women as really benefiting their entire community. It's like Barbara Jordan's work was just not about women, it was about the entire community. So I just wanted to mention that. I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you. This is a moving story, and I wanted to reach forward for all generations of young women to come. But there were 3 women, Olivia Turner, Rosa Yoakum, and Florence Long. And unfortunately, we don't have photos of any of those 3 women, even though we've been in contact with descendants. I feel like that's a big hole for us because they're lionesses as well as Hortense in this movement and the courage that they had. But there were 3 women. There was 1 woman on the ballot, which was statewide, Annie Blanton Webb. And she was a Houstonian, but she was in Austin, and she did win. She won in 1918. She was in education. So Houston is really the place that was the farm for women's organizing, even at the state level, which you discussed earlier about the efforts with passing the laws with the state legislature. Oh, there's one other thing about Hortense. She felt very strongly about protecting women who were working women in factories. And in 1918, one of the other laws that was passed within a week or so of the primary law was a law improving the working conditions for women in factories, getting them bathrooms and cleanliness and hygiene. So she had a very broad view.
Well, she was also a tireless crusader against the Ku Klux Klan in Texas. She did all kinds of things. She was a rabble rouser and doing things that were very dangerous for women at the time.
Yes, in agreement. And that's the next chapter, is when the suffragists turned their focus in 1924 against the Klan. Yes, it's that army. Yes.
Do we have any other questions for our panelists, Linda and Cisselon? Anne?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I believe it was 1928, 26 that Hortense Ward ran for county judge here in Houston. And her slogan was, "Don't vote for me because I'm a woman, but don't vote against me because I'm a woman."
I love that.
I love that. This is Ray again. There was the event on October 23rd. We're identifying everyone who's in the photos because, as you know, as researchers, you've been uncovering the women in law in the past, and we, the Suffragist Project, are creating archives and images with everyone identified that is going into the University of Houston's special collections for their women. And so we want all the photos with everyone's names in them, so women of the future can look to what we're doing this year, and they will have they'll have a record of what we're discussing and what we're uncovering now, and the women who are participating.
Thanks, Ray. Any other questions for our panelists, Linda and Cisselon?
Thank you.
I just have one final comment, which is that we certainly chronicled a couple of women. There were so many more that we could have talked about, so many courageous women that we just didn't have time to talk about. And we could have talked about all the ones we did mention for a much longer time. But, you know, the fact that history really has not brought forth the attention that these women deserve is something that we need to all take notice of and learn more about these amazing women who had left a great legacy for us.
And I would like to thank you guys for doing a comprehensive view as well, and really putting and highlighting the role of Black women in particular in this struggle. One of my heroines is also Ida B. Wells, and she fought with the white suffragist leaders because a lot of them were very racist, and the Black women in the March on Washington were only offered to participate at the back, you know, and so a lot of that sometimes is glossed over. The second point is that I noticed that our executive director and assistant director from the center are both on this call, and I would like
is our development director as well.
That's true. And we would like to thank them for their support. And we will also make sure the video is audible when you put this on the website. I think we can probably go in and fix that. So thank you, Ronnie, Valerie, and Abby for all that you do to keep the center going. And I'm very excited about y'all's project. I will be looking to help out if this extrovert is very tired of the pandemic. So when I get my freedom, I will probably be rushing over to the museum so that
please,
I can participate. So thank you all.
Yes, you'll love it. Well, thank you. I think that wraps it up. We appreciate you all joining us. This has been a wonderful lecture series. And of course, thank you to these wonderful co-curators, Ann Sloan, Betty Chapman, and Ray Bryant. We wouldn't be here if you all had not come to the Heritage Society with this wonderful idea. So we are forever grateful. Thank you all. That wraps it up. And this will be on our YouTube channel. So look us up and subscribe. We would love to have more subscribers. All right. Goodbye, everybody.